The rain had been falling for hours, soft and steady, like a lullaby meant for broken hearts. Elena sat by the window, wrapped in a shawl that still faintly smelled of lavender and loss. Her hands held a cold cup of tea she had no intention of drinking. Since her husband Richard passed away 6 months ago, the house had turned quiet in a way that felt almost cruel. It wasn't just silence, it was absence. The absence of footsteps in the hallway, the way he used to hum tunelessly while shaving, the little notes he used to leave beside the kettle every morning. "Don't forget to eat today. I love you." Elena had forgotten what it was like to be touched, to be looked at like she was someone worth looking at. Grief had settled into her bones, and with every passing day, she seemed to vanish more into the walls of the house they once called home. She thought she'd have to face all of it alone, until one evening, just as the skies darkened, her doorbell rang. When she opened it, she saw him standing there, tall and hesitant, soaked from the rain, but with eyes that looked right through her sadness. Jason, her stepson. Richard's son from his first marriage. They weren't close. Not really. He had been polite and distant at the funeral, and before that, just a name she heard occasionally. But now, he stood at her doorstep with a single duffel bag and a quiet kind of worry in his eyes. "I figured you shouldn't be alone," he said, his voice low, uncertain. Elena didn't respond with words. She simply stepped aside and let him in. That's how it began. Two people bound not by blood, but by grief. In the days that followed, Jason moved through the house like someone who had always belonged there. He fixed things, quietly, without being asked. The leaky tap, the squeaky stair, the garden that had turned wild with weeds. He didn't talk much, but he listened. And more than once Elena caught him watching her, not with pity, but with something softer. Something curious. She noticed things, too. The way his eyes lingered when she passed by in the kitchen, or how he sat a little closer on the couch when they watched the old black and white movies Richard once loved. There was something magnetic about him, and energy she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't forbidden, but it felt like it should be. And maybe that was why her heart beat a little faster when he walked into the room. Maybe that was why she started brushing her hair in the morning again. It wasn't about replacing Richard. It wasn't about guilt. It was about the aching hum of being seen after being invisible for too long. One night, as the rain returned and the lights flickered low, they sat across from each other in the living room. Jason held a book in his lap, unread, and Elena sipped her wine too slowly, unsure what to say. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with something unspoken. "It's strange," she finally whispered. "How someone can be gone. And yet everything still looks the same." Jason looked at her for a long moment. "You don't look the same," he said. "You look like someone holding in too much." The words undid something inside her. That night, she didn't cry. But when he stood to leave the room, and his hand lightly brushed hers, she didn't pull away. In that quiet, flickering moment, something fragile and new passed between them. Something neither of them dared to name just yet. The days that followed blurred into one another, but something in the air between Elena and Jason had quietly shifted. It wasn't sudden or loud. It was gentle, like spring seeping into a frozen garden. She began to notice the little things he did, the kind of things no one else would have thought to do. He brought her tea in the evenings without asking what she wanted. He replaced the light bulbs before they burned out. He cleaned the gutters, trimmed the overgrown rosebush Richard had once cared for, and played old vinyl records in the evenings, records she hadn't touched since her husband died. Jason never tried to fix her sadness. He just let it exist, beside them like a quiet companion. And maybe that's why Elena started to breathe a little easier. Maybe that's why her eyes followed him when he left the room, and lingered a little too long when he returned. It wasn't just what he did, it was how he looked at her. He saw her, not as someone broken or burdened, but as someone still whole, still beautiful, even in her grief. One evening, Elena was in the attic, sorting through a box of Richard's old things, chasing a feeling she couldn't name. She found their wedding photo, sunlight on her veil, his arm around her waist, that wide, youthful smile she hadn't seen in years. The memory hit harder than expected. She clutched the frame to her chest, and without warning, the tears came, heavy and quiet. She didn't hear Jason coming up the stairs, didn't hear the floorboards creak beneath his steps. But when she looked up, there he was, standing in the doorway with a cup of chamomile tea and those calm, steady eyes. "I heard you," he said softly, not moving closer, not pushing her to explain. That simple kindness broke her all over again. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Jason stepped forward, placed the cup down beside her, and knelt on one knee. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer advice. Instead, he brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear with the most delicate touch, and for a moment, her whole body went still. The warmth of his hand on her cheek lingered longer than it should have. He didn't kiss her. He didn't try. But she felt it. There, in the quiet space between grief and something dangerously close to longing. When he stood, he helped her, up without a word, and they walked down the stairs together in silence, but the air around them was no longer the same. After that, their moments began to stretch, to deepen. Their dinners turned into long conversations and lingering glances across the table. Sometimes Jason would read to her on the porch while the sun set. Sometimes she'd sit beside him on the couch, closer than necessary, and feel the heat of his body beside hers. It still didn't feel right, but it didn't feel wrong either. She tried to tell herself it was loneliness, that she missed companionship, closeness, warmth. But when he smiled at her with that gentle, half-curious expression, her heart didn't ache. It fluttered. She hadn't felt that in years. And though nothing had been spoken aloud, Elena knew something had begun to bloom between them. It was fragile and quiet and wrapped in uncertainty. But it was real. One night, as Jason stood behind her in the kitchen, helping dry the dishes, his fingers brushed hers. She turned slightly, just enough to meet his eyes. Neither of them moved. The air felt thick with all the things they weren't yet brave enough to say. And in that pause, in that perfect stillness, her heart whispered what her lips couldn't. "I'm starting to need you, and I don't know how to stop." Elena couldn't sleep that night. The rain had returned, tapping softly on the roof, echoing the restlessness inside her chest. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the soft rustle of leaves outside the only sound in a house that felt too big and too quiet again. But this time, it wasn't grief that kept her awake. It was the ache of something else, something new, something terrifying. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jason. The way he looked at her that morning, when she laughed at one of his dry jokes and caught him smiling at her like she was more than just the woman his father once loved. It wasn't just kindness in his eyes anymore. It was depth. It was longing. And it mirrored her own. She wrapped the robe around her and stepped out into the hallway, barefoot, heart racing, telling herself she was just going to get water. But her feet moved with a mind of their own, carrying her toward his room like she'd done it 100 times before. She paused at the door, hand trembling slightly, ashamed of the way she was hoping he'd still be awake. Before she could knock, before she could even breathe, he opened the door. Jason was already standing there as if he'd been waiting. He said nothing at first, just looked at her with those gentle, steady eyes that always made her feel more seen than judged. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words tangled in her throat. So she spoke honestly instead. "I didn't want to be alone tonight." Her voice was almost a whisper, fragile, but honest. Jason didn't flinch. He didn't question her or make her explain the kind of loneliness that had been eating away at her since Richard passed. He simply stepped aside, his eyes never leaving hers, silently inviting her into the only space in the house that felt warm. She stepped in. The room smelled faintly of pine and linen, neat and lived in. There were books stacked by the window, a folded sweater draped over the back of a chair, a sense of quiet masculinity that didn't overwhelm but comforted. Jason walked over to the edge of the bed and sat down, then looked up at her. "You can stay," he said gently. "Just stay." And she did. She sat beside him, close but not quite touching, both of them wrapped in the thick silence of what they weren't saying. They didn't reach for each other. They didn't need to. The closeness was already charged with something tender and unspeakable. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the stillness, her shoulder brushing, his ever so slightly. That one small touch sent something electric through her. Not lust, not guilt. Just the ache of connection, of being held, finally, without being touched. She could feel the pull between them, quiet but strong, like gravity. The intimacy was in the silence, in the way they sat close enough to feel each other's breath. It was in the way Jason didn't try to fix her, didn't reach for more, even though she sensed he wanted to. That restraint, that gentle care, only deepened her longing. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jason turned, his head, just enough to meet her gaze. His eyes were soft, but firm with quiet promise. "You don't have to thank me. I meant it. I'm here." She didn't say another word. She didn't have to. In that room, on that rainy night, wrapped in the soft hum of two hearts mourning and mending, Elena realized something profound. She wasn't just missing Richard anymore. She was craving something she hadn't dared to believe she deserved again. Comfort, closeness, and maybe love. Morning light crept slowly through the curtains, painting the room in soft gold. Elena stirred first, waking to the unfamiliar but comforting warmth of someone beside her. Her head rested gently on Jason's shoulder, their bodies still and close, though they hadn't moved beyond the quiet presence they'd shared the night before. Nothing had happened, not in the way people might think, and yet something undeniable, had changed. She could feel it in the steady rise and fall of his chest beneath her cheek, in the peace that had settled deep inside her bones for the first time in what felt like forever. She hadn't slept that soundly in months. Slowly, she sat up, careful not to wake him, but Jason's eyes opened almost instantly, as if he'd been aware of her every movement. Their eyes met in the morning hush, and neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. There was nothing awkward in the air, only tenderness, quiet understanding. Elena felt vulnerable, raw in a way that was both terrifying and strangely beautiful. But she also felt safe. Safer than she had in a long, long time. As she stood and smoothed her robe, Jason simply nodded toward the door. "I'll make coffee," he said, his voice husky from sleep. Downstairs, the scent of fresh brew filled the kitchen. Elena moved like she was in a dream, brushing her hair back, smoothing her blouse, trying to find her footing between the past she still carried and the future she was cautiously beginning to want. Jason poured her a cup without asking, just as he always did. Their fingers touched briefly as she took it, and that single, electric contact lit a warmth in her chest that made her breath catch. She wasn't a fool. She knew how this might look, from the outside. Knew the lines they were dangerously close to blurring. But the truth of it lived in her chest, not in anyone else's judgment. She wasn't replacing Richard. She was rediscovering herself, her softness, her desire, her right to feel again. Jason leaned against the counter, watching her with eyes that held no pressure, only presence. "You okay?" he asked gently. Elena nodded, holding her cup close like a shield. "Better than I've been in a while," she said. And it was the truth. They didn't speak of the night again, not directly. But the air between them changed. Their moments became quieter, deeper. Their conversations held longer pauses, not from discomfort, but from awareness. They'd grown used to each other, but now every look, every touch, every accidental brush of hands seemed to mean something more. That evening, Elena found a small folded note on her pillow. Jason's handwriting was careful and clean. "Whatever. This is whatever it becomes. I just want you to know. I'm here. You'll never have to face any of it alone." Her hand trembled slightly as she held the note to her chest. No man had written her something like that in years, not since Richard. But this was different. This wasn't a promise of forever. It was a promise of presence, of care, of a man who saw her not as a widow, not as someone he was obligated to protect, but as a woman worth choosing. The note didn't ask for anything in return, and maybe that's why it meant everything. That night, as she sat by the window with the stars glowing above the garden, Elena smiled softly. The pain hadn't vanished, but for the first time, it wasn't the only thing she felt. There was something else now. A whisper of love, wrapped in quiet hope. And as Jason stepped onto the porch and sat beside her, their shoulders touching, once more she knew. She hadn't just turned to him in a moment of need. She had found him, and he hadn't even hesitated.